So welcome to the first of our two PHP challenges. This is the smaller of the two, but it should give you an opportunity to practice pretty much everything that we've covered, especially the post variables and sending emails in PHP. And it will also use our bootstrap skills and a little bit of jQuery as well. So this is what we're after. We want a nice looking bootstrap based contact form. So this is what we're after. We want a nice bootstrap based form which asks for the user's email address, the subject of their message, and the content of their message. We then want some jQuery validation. So if we try and submit the form incorrectly, it gives us messages telling us what we need to fix. And then if we submit the form supposedly correctly, at least as far as the computer can tell, then it sends the message. And we're actually doing PHP server-side validation as well. So we're checking that the email address is valid, we're checking that the subject and content are there, and that the email address is there as well. And that's important because you can't just do JavaScript validation, because someone may have JavaScript turned off, for example, or be posting to your form directly, and then you do need to validate on the server side with PHP as well. So that's it. You've definitely got almost all those skills. There's just a couple of small bits that we haven't covered, but you can definitely get those with a very quick bit of Googling. So as always, give it a good go yourself, and then I'll go through it afterwards. Best of luck. All right, I hope that went well. I'm going to start by getting our Bootstrap template, which I'm going to find by searching for Bootstrap 4. And that takes me to this page. It may well take you to a different page if Bootstrap is in a later version by the time you're watching this course. And then I'm going to click Download Bootstrap and Introduction. And then find the starter template. There we go. So let's just save that and make sure we've got something that looks bootstrappy. There it is. Wonderful. So let's pop that into a container div. And we'll change the H1 to get in touch. Wonderful. Now we're going to want a Bootstrap form. So I'm going to go back over to Bootstrap and find the form which is under components. And there we go. And we'll copy and paste the code of the most similar form that we're after. In fact, that top one should work just fine. And there's no shame in copying and pasting. In fact, you're less likely to make mistakes or forget things if you copy and paste from templates. So as long as you remember to update all of the code to what you need, that's absolutely fine. All right, let's see. So there's our very nice looking form, rather more than we need. So let's start customizing it. So we're going to keep this form pretty simple. We're going to need an email address, a subject line, and then a text area for them to put the main content of what they want to get in touch about. So I'm going to keep the email address and the password, which will become our subject line. And then we'll get rid of the selects and everything up to the text area. We'll keep the text area. And then we'll get rid of everything else all the way down to the submit button. So let's have a look at that. Should be a bit more manageable. Excellent. That looks great. So that first one, I want to get rid of all of the examples. So I'm just going to call this email, and we'll leave that as it is. ID is going to be email, And I'm just going to change that to enter your email address. We'll leave the "we'll never share your email with anyone else." That's generally a good idea to say that. And then I'll change password to subject. And this is going to be subject, and the type now is just text with an ID of subject, and I think we won't have a placeholder for that one. Let's have a look. Excellent. And for the label for the text area, we'll have something like, "What would you like to ask us?" Something like that. And I'll call that content. And 3 rows is fine. There we go. So that's all looking good. Now let's add a little bit of validation. So on the JavaScript side, the email address will already be validated. That's taken care of within Bootstrap. But we want to insist upon the subject and the content fields to be filled in. So let's add an ID to our button. We'll just call it submit. And then we want to run some jQuery when the button is clicked. So I'll add that down here underneath the Bootstrap and jQuery. So we'll have a script with a type of text/JavaScript. So at the moment when we click the submit button, it of course submits the form. And we want to stop that happening so that we can do our validation and then submit the form manually if it passes the validation. So we haven't done that before, so let's do a quick Google. Something like "stop form submitting jQuery." Okay, so we could look at the submit API documentation. I think this second route is going to be quicker though. Stop form submitting using jQuery. Okay, let's have a look. Aha! So what we've got here, it's selecting the form and then it's doing something on submit, and then we've got this function e.preventDefault which stops it from submitting the form. So that looks like it's perfect from our point of view. So let's just add in the close parentheses there. And then let's take a look. If we now submit, you can see it's not refreshing the page. Brilliant. So now let's do our validation. And we'll do that in just the same way that we did before. So we'll set the error string initially to an empty string, and then we'll check for the values of the subject and content fields, and if they're empty, then we'll add to the error string. So if subject field, so that's $ and then subject, so that gets the subject field, we want to get the value of the subject field, and we want to check to see if that's equal to an empty string, i.e. if it's empty. And if it is, we want to append to the error string. So we can do that with either error plus equals or error equals error plus and then something. But plus equals is a little bit neater, so we'll go for that one. And we'll have something like the subject field is required. And then I'll do the same for content in a moment, but I want to check that it's all working properly first. So let's add an empty error div, which is where we're going to contain our error. And then we'll select that, just like that. And then we want to set the HTML of the error div to error. There we go. Okay, so let's just check, see if that works. Excellent. Subject field is required. And if there is a subject, then that becomes empty. Brilliant. So let's just copy and paste all of that because it's very similar for the content div. So we just change subject to content. And then we'll just change the error message as well to the content field is required. Okay, let's have a look. Excellent. Okay, now that's nice, but I think we could make it even nicer by using the Bootstrap alerts. So let's go back to Bootstrap and find those alerts in the documentation and components. And there we go. There are the alerts. So it's perfect for this sort of thing. I think a danger alert, that red one at the bottom there, would be perfect for us. Okay, so we want to surround our error message with these div classes. So what we'll do is we'll check first off to see if there is an error message. So if the error message, if the error variable is not empty, then we don't just want to set the HTML to error, we want to set the HTML to a string with the error message in the middle. So first off, there's our string. Now one issue we might have here is that it's going over several lines, which is not great for JavaScript because that will think that it's the end of the command. And secondly, you'll notice I've used single quotes to define our div text, and that's because there are double quotes inside the div itself. So if I try and use double quotes, then you will see that it expects this to be the end of the string, which of course it's not. The other option there is to use backslash, as we have seen earlier on in the course, and that is a way of saying that we actually want to include this double quote in our string. It's not the end of the string. But I think it's simpler to just use single quotes around the edge and then double quotes in the middle. Okay. So now let's add some text to this. We can say there were errors, either 1 or 2, in your form, and then we can include the error message like that. There we go. So we've now got the alert div content, which should make it look a bit prettier. Let's have a look. So here we go. So if I put nothing in, there we go. So that's a much clearer and prettier way of showing the user's error messages. I think one thing I might alter slightly is just the layout there, because I don't like that these are too separated. So I think what I'll try is putting the strong error message inside paragraph tags, and then just using BR to separate these two. So I'll put a BR in there. We don't need one at the end of the second one. So let's have a look. There we go. I think that's a little bit neater than what we had before. But you can of course play with the spacings and add margins or paddings if you want to. Great. So now we want to submit the form if there are no errors. So how do we do that? Let's go back to our jQuery form submitting question that we looked at on Stack Overflow, because that was doing exactly what we want to do. Let's see if we can figure it out from this answer. And now looking at the bottom of this answer, I think we've got what I need just here. So this does quite an interesting thing. We have seen the unbind command before, but the problem that we have is if we just submit the form, then that's going to go through this whole validation again. So it's just going to become recursive and it'll never actually do the submission. So what we actually need to do is unbind the function that we've attached to the submit of that form and then submit it. So we're basically saying don't do the validation anymore because we've already done it once, but do the normal form submission. So let's grab that and pop it in just there. So we're unbinding the submit. Would still work with single quotes, but I like to have everything the same. So let's have a look. So let's just put in a subject. Okay, great. That works fine. If we put in content as well, then the form gets submitted, or at least it looks like it does. Wonderful. One slight issue you may have noticed is that if the user leaves the email address blank, then we don't get the jQuery validation. So we do actually need to check to see if there's an email address as well. So that's easy enough. We just change that so that we're now checking for email as well. Okay, let's have a look. So now if we put in subject and content, still doesn't work because we still need the email field. So then we put a false email, that doesn't work. So we really have to be pretty on our game and actually fill everything in correctly to get a submission. There we go. Right, so now we're done on the JavaScript and jQuery front. So now it's time to process our PHP. So I'm going to do that as usual at the very top of our script. And we'll start by just displaying the post variables. So let's see. Now, interestingly, you see we've got an empty array here. There is a good reason for that. And that is, even though we've given these inputs IDs, we haven't given them names. And it's actually the name that is passed through to the post variable on the server. So we need to go through and just give them the same name as the ID. Oh, and just before we test that, we'll also need to change the form method to post. Otherwise we won't see anything. Okay, so let's reload that page and then just put in some dummy content and take a look. There we go. All right, now that we've got our demo content, we need to do our server-side validation as well. It might seem like overkill, but you definitely shouldn't rely just on JavaScript validation because someone could easily have their JavaScript turned off, or they might post to your script in some other way. So you should definitely do server-side validation as well as the JavaScript stuff. So that we need to set up in much the same way as we did before. So we'll do a check first off to see if there are any post variables. Then we'll set our error to an empty string. We'll check to see if the email address is empty, and there's actually quite an easy way to do that in PHP. We can put an exclamation mark in front of it. So that checks to see either if there's no email post variable at all or that the post variable is empty. So then we'll append to error using dot this time rather than plus because we're in PHP. We'll have an email address is required. And again, we'll have BR as well. And then we'll do the same for content. So the content field is required, and for subject. And it'd be worth validating the email address again as well. Let's see if we can find a way to do that. We validated an email address in jQuery before, but this looks pretty perfect. Validate email filter. There we go. So we've actually got a built-in function in PHP to do that. We don't have to create the nasty validation string that we did in jQuery. So let's pop this in here. So the email address that we're validating is the post email. We only care if it's not valid. So if we take away this exclamation mark there, that should check to see if the filter is false and therefore it's not valid. There we go. So we don't just want to echo that error, we want to add it to the error string. So the email address is invalid. Okay, and then we want to do something very similar to what we did here. If there's an error message, then we want to create some HTML. So if our error string is no longer empty, then this is the bit that we need to essentially copy and paste. What we'll do is we'll take error and we'll set it equal to all of that. But let's do this properly. In PHP, that is. And close the command. So now we've got our complete error string. Now, how do we get that onto our page? Well, it actually carries down this variable throughout the script. So what we can do is right here in our error div, we can just echo error. And if it's empty, it won't echo anything, which is fine. But if there's an error, then it will display it there. Okay, just to check this out, I'm just going to temporarily cut the code from the script so that we can stop the JavaScript validation and try out the PHP validation. Oh, you'll notice we've got an undefined variable there. It's not an error, but it is a notice, so be good to fix it. And that's because I've only created my error variable if there's a post. So if I define it either way, then that notice should go away. Great. Okay, so let's just put some content in there and then submit. Then, excellent. The email address is required, subject is required, and the email address is invalid. Now that's not entirely true. They didn't put in an email address, so it's not quite invalid. So I think we'll just add this to check if there is an email address and it doesn't pass the validation, then it's invalid. So let's resubmit that. There we go. So we get an email address is required, but we don't get it's invalid if it's not there. Okay. We're getting close. So we've now got our server-side and our client-side validation in place. You might wonder why we need the JavaScript validation if we're going to do the server-side validation anyway. The simple reason is it makes our script a bit nicer to use, so they don't have to wait for the form to submit and the page to reload to get their error message. So now that we've got all our validation, all that remains is to send our form. So we're going to do this if there's no error message. And let's set all the variables as necessary. So email to, that's just going to be me at mydomain.com. Subject, I will set equal to the subject that the user entered. content, again, I'll set equal to the content that the user entered, and the headers, if you remember, are from, and I'll set it equal to the user's email. That means that when this email pops up in your mailbox, you'll be able to reply to it straight away to get back to the customer or user or whoever they are. And then we'll try and send it. So mail, email to, subject, content, headers. And if that works, well, we want to have a success message. So let's have success message is equal to, and it's going to be very similar to this, except instead of a danger, we're going to have a success alert, so it's nice and green. And we'll say something like, your message was sent, we'll get back to you ASAP. And notice we've got a single quote in there, so I'm going to put a backslash in to escape that. So it means it will just be displayed rather than think of it as the end of the string. And then what we can do is just display success message along with the error message. Because we're never going to get both at once. Either it's going to be successful or it's not. Of course, there is the option that it won't work. So in this case, we'll have an error message. I'll just have something generic like, your message couldn't be sent. Please try again later. And again, a backslash there. Okay, so let's have a look. We'll just refresh that. Oh, we've got an undefined variable. Again, yep. So we'll need to just make success message an empty string there as well. Okay, so let's put our generic information in and take a look. Wonderful. Message was sent, we'll get back to you ASAP. And just to check that the error here would work, let's resubmit that. And excellent. So the message couldn't be sent. Info is being sent there as well. I think that's a little bit too dark. Let's get rid of the strongs there. Wonderful. So that's as far as we're going to go with this. There's obviously lots more that you could do with a contact form, but this has got the basics up and running. And that brings us more or less to the end of the PHP section of this course, except of course for our big PHP challenge, where we're going to be making a weather web app. We'll do that in the next video. Actually, before we finish, I just want to show you one slight issue with the script in its current form. If you've tried it out, you may notice that once we get everything right, we actually have to press the submit button twice. So once there, and then again to submit it. That's obviously not a great solution, so I'm going to show you a different way of submitting and not submitting the form, which doesn't have that problem. So first off, let's get rid of our unbinding and then submitting. And we're also going to get rid of the prevent default. And all we're going to do is we're going to add the code return false if there is an error. And return false is essentially the JavaScript way of saying, in this case, something's gone wrong. So we don't want to submit the form. In this case, however, we do want to submit the form. So we'll return true. And that does the same job as before, but it doesn't have the problem of having to click twice. So just to check, we still get the validation, but when we enter everything correctly, it works first click. So I'd recommend doing things that way rather than using the unbinding and submit method. All right, on to the weather scraper.